Exam date and time. It's a 1-hour exam. You will actually have all the time in the world. I'll stay late. One more time. One more time. It'll work. Eventually it'll work. And the usual thing is, by the time I get it working, the semester's over, and then it's working perfectly right at the very end, because of course it is. Right. It's going to be in Black Rock Exam Center, which is a huge exam center over in Black Rock campus of the Smurfett School. Miserable experience, but it's the only room big enough to hold us all, so that's where we're gonna be. It's in the evening, right before the break. Yeah, that's the deal. So you're going to have to allow time to get over to Black Rock and all of that. Okay. Yeah, that's what I have to say about that. I don't think I have anything deeper, insightful to say about that, but that's the deal. Now we were over on the Phillips curve, and I believe we were on page 22. Phillips curve. And we were talking about indifference curves. Right? And we were talking about the fact that in order to make an indifference curve, what I do is wherever you're starting from, any place you're starting from, I do something nice to you. And that, for example, is moving. If I do something nice, we are, for example, I give you wine, we move in this direction, and that makes you happier. And so to get you the equal happy that you were to begin with, we need to do something bad to you. We destroy a school book until you're equally happy where you were before, and that's an indifference curve. And of course, there's a whole series of these indifference curves because we could have started up here instead, in which case you would have been happier than you were in the initial point because you got more of everything. And we would do the same thing. Give you more wine, makes you happy. Take away your school books till you get back to the same thing. So every single point has an indifference curve through it, and this way of representing preferences, we're just trying to get on the best indifference curve that we can. In this case, that's the highest indifference curves, but it's not going to be that way for us. We can think, for example, here's another set of indifference curves. This is for milk and eggs. And the thing is, in microeconomics, we always assumed that more was better, right? And so that's why we got the indifference curves that we want. But you will notice that people with tons and tons of money don't buy literally tons and tons of eggs for their home, right? If I said to you, I am going to deliver you milk, and I bring milk to your doorstep every morning, that's a nice thing. If then I said, well, I gave you 1 milk yesterday, let me give you 50 tons of milk tomorrow, and you're not allowed to sell it. You're just actually going to have 50 tons of milk in your house. Well, what you have now is a problem, right? There is an ideal amount of milk. You don't want more milk than that. You don't want less milk than that. Too much milk becomes a burden rather than a blessing, right? And same thing with eggs or anything else, really. Right? And this is why Bill Gates doesn't have tons of milk. He just has the amount of milk that he wants to drink, and probably a big reserve in the fridge. But there's a limited amount that he has, even though he has tons of money, right? And so there is what we call a bliss point. There's an ideal point where at that point you have all of the milk and eggs that you want. You don't actually want any more, and you don't want any less. Okay? Now we normally ignore that in economics, in microeconomics, because we are talking about people dealing with the budget. And clearly someone dealing with a budget where they have to trade one thing off for another isn't going to buy more milk than they want. So in reality, we're going to be in this area, in microeconomics, we're going to be in this area of the curve. And so we just draw in indifference curves looking like that, where it's better to have more milk and it's better to have more butter. Okay? But we can do the same exercise that we did before. And we can say, suppose that we have too much milk and too much butter. Too much milk and too much butter, and then we do something, or we give the guy more milk. We give him more milk. And as we do that, we make him sad, right? Because he already has too much milk, and now he has even more that he has to dispose of. It is just a bigger problem, and he says, screw you, Ivan, I hate you and your stupid indifference curves testing, but well, it's science. He's just got to put up with it. Okay, but we're doing indifference curves, and so we made him unhappy. We have to make him happy, and so we need to do something with eggs to make him happy the same as he was before, and here he has too many eggs, so what we have to do is we have to take away eggs. And that makes him happy. Okay, and that gives us our indifference curves, and you can see it has that sort of shape. Okay, likewise, we could start out here, where he has too much milk, but he doesn't have enough eggs. Okay? And so we do the same thing. We add milk. He has too much milk already, so adding milk makes him sad. So we have to do something nice to him to make up for it. And now he has too little eggs, so a nice thing we can do to him is to give him more eggs. Right? And so we move up in this direction, and that makes him happy. Right? And we balance him out. And so you can see it has this sort of shape in that region. And we could do the upper left region if we wanted to. You can do it yourself at home, but it's not going to be relevant for us in what we're doing now, so I'm going to leave it be. Right? And so these things are concentric circles. You want to get as close to that bliss point as you can, and you just pick the best indifference curve, which in this case is the most central indifference curve. Right? If we were just looking at the lower left-hand quadrant, it would be moving up this way would be better. But if we're up here, moving down this way is better. And if we're here, moving in that direction is better, and so on. Okay? So here, we've got two things which are good. We want more of them. Here we have two things which are bad. We want less of both of them. And here we've got one thing which is bad, which is the milk, and the other thing which is good, which is the eggs, and so on and so forth for that one. Okay? Okay. So if we get over to unemployment and inflation, we can think that both unemployment and inflation at the place we're at are bad things, right? So we would like, if we wanted to do something nice to him, we would get rid of unemployment. Then we would have to do something bad to him and give him more inflation to get the same indifference curve. So this is the indifference curve of our central bank. And in fact, I don't really like the graph I drew. I know there's no one to blame but myself, but nevertheless, we will add one in. If we have we've got unemployment, we've got inflation, and remember he had a target, unemployment target, and he had an inflation target, right? So if I extend those out like that, his indifference curves are going to be very similar to what we saw. If he had the target in both, that's bliss. If he's up here, he's got too much of both of them. So his indifference curve will look something like, oh, that's very sad. Okay, do it properly. So that's still pretty sad, something like that. And down here, he's got too much unemployment, but he doesn't have enough inflation. And so his indifference curve is going to look something like that. And importantly, it's going to be just vertical at this point, because it's switching between inflation being too low and inflation being too high. Just as we had with the milk and eggs, if we go back, milk and eggs, we're looking at, think about this as unemployment, think about this as inflation, and when he has these two targets, his indifference curves are going to be concentric circles, or ovals, or something like that, right? So it's exactly the same thing, but he's going to have circles going around his bliss point. Okay. And there's going to be bigger ones, and moving in this direction is better. Okay. And that's why the digression into what indifference curves look like. Okay. Okay. Okay, so let's go back to our graph. And this is the same graph we had before. And we're asking the question is it possible for him to achieve his inflation target? So we're saying, is there an equilibrium where he achieves his target inflation? And now we're doing the same thing that we argued sort of in words before. Now we're doing it with indifference curves. And so if he's going to, in equilibrium, get his inflation target, and that really is equilibrium, then people are going to expect that as their expected inflation. Right? So this will be expected inflation as well, if this is an equilibrium, which we know it's not. But if it were an equilibrium, they would expect the inflation target. And so we would get this short-run Phillips curve. So if they got the inflation they wanted, or they expected, they would get the natural rate of unemployment. If everything's normal, you get the normal rate of unemployment, the natural rate. Right? Okay. But at that point A, we have the indifference curve is going this way, and it's just vertical here, and it starts to bend under here, which means the indifference curve sort of is crossing this short-run Phillips curve. And remember, his goal is to get to this point, or as close to this point as he possibly can, his bliss point. And so this lower indifference curve is better, and because the Phillips curve crosses his indifference curve, he can get on a better indifference curve. And so he's going to choose point B rather than point A, even though he promised he was going to give inflation equal to the target rate. In practice, he won't, because once he does that, people will set their wage expectations, and then he has an incentive to screw them over because he's very close to his target inflation, but he's far off from his target unemployment. And so he wants to reduce unemployment by trading it off against inflation. Okay. Yeah?
So where's the bliss point again?
So the bliss point, sorry about that. The bliss point would be where he gets both his targets. So that would be moving up here. This would be bliss. Okay, so there's some kind of vague ovally things around the bliss point. They don't have to be circles, but circles are, of course, easiest to draw. Okay. Oh, I'm going to die. One of these days, I'm definitely going to die. It's either going to be falling off something, or you guys are all going to mob me and just tear me limb from limb. One of those two things is going to happen, I'm sure of it. I don't like to be up here. I like to be like access to the I can run. I don't know, I have a zombie movie in my mind somewhere. Okay, so there we are. This graph is saying what you're supposed to get out of this is that there cannot be an equilibrium where you get your target rate of inflation. Right? Because if there were, he wouldn't give it to us. Central bank wouldn't give it to us. That's what we're getting out of here. So neither A or B are equilibrium outcomes. Right? It's just, this cannot be an equilibrium. Okay, so what does the equilibrium have to look like? Well, in the long run, people's expected inflation has to be equal to the actual inflation. Otherwise, they would be changing their expectations, right? And so that could happen in the short run, but it couldn't happen in the long run. Okay? And the central bank must be doing the best it can. So it must be on the lowest indifference curve that it possibly can get on, given this Phillips curve. So you can think about this Phillips curve. Once expectations are set, this Phillips curve is like a budget constraint for a consumer. These are the things it can choose from. When we had a budget constraint for a consumer, that was the things that a consumer could choose from, and they chose the best one. Once we have a Phillips curve, that's the things that the central bank can choose from, and it just picks the best one, the best indifference curve, which is, in this case, the closest one to the bliss point. Okay. So here we go. It's going to look something like this. Okay, we have point C, and point C has this feature where we have a expected inflation is equal to actual inflation. So people are getting what they expect. That gives us this short-run Phillips curve, right? And he's doing the best he can, and he's giving us just the inflation we expected. Okay, and this difference here is our inflation bias. Okay. We could technically get the target inflation level, because we have total control over inflation. But we're getting this higher rate of inflation, and we've gained nothing from it because we have the natural rate of unemployment either way. Okay? Okay. So one of the arguments, and the nice thing about this model is we can see a lot of what modern central bankers worry about in this model. For example, one of the things you could imagine is that we just have a legal requirement on the central bank. It says, central bank, you must give us 2% inflation. If you're more or less, if you're off from 2% inflation, we're going to take you out, we're going to shoot you, and we're going to murder your dog, and it's just going to be bad, right? Just make it a law. We send you to jail with all the insider traders that we put in jail. So anyway, we do something really, really bad to you in a legal sense so that you can say, well, okay, maybe I want to control unemployment, but I don't want them killing my dog, and so I'm going to give them the target rate of inflation. So here we're tying their hands. We're constraining them to a particular rule and not giving them freedom to change the money supply. They have to give us 2% inflation on pain of dog, right? And in that case, all these indifference curves are really irrelevant because if we don't give them the target rate of inflation, horrible things happen. And we don't care about unemployment nearly as much as we care about our dog, obviously. And so this would work. Okay? And this is something that we can do, we have the power to do. That, generally speaking, is not what we actually do. We actually do give the central bank some kind of discretion over the monetary policy, which means they're not going to jail, we're not murdering their dog, which means we're going to be in this situation where we get this inflation bias. Okay? So that is the cost of one of the costs of having freedom to set monetary policy any way you want. Okay? The benefits we don't quite see here in this, which is in a bad time, in a recession, you can use monetary policy to get out of the recession or to help get out of the recession. So we don't see the flexibility that monetary policy gives you, but we do see that the fact that you have flexibility has this cost in higher than desired inflation. Okay. All right. And there's various debates, like, how much flexibility do you want to give them? Another bad side about giving them flexibility, of course, is that they can go hog wild and start hyperinflations and stuff, right? And that historically has happened. So that is something to worry about. In particular, looking back on things, it tends to happen at points where the government has a great need for money and they have a lot of say on what the central bank does. So one of the things that we've done with modern central banks is we've tried to the extent possible to make them separate from the government so that when the government really needs money, the central bank, I don't care about you and your problems. Right? Now that's not entirely possible to do, right? Because governments are involved in appointing these guys. Governments can't have them taken out and shot. If the government sets the rules for the central banker, they can change the rules for the central banker. Right? So technically, we can never totally divorce the central bank totally from the government, but to the extent possible, we hire this guy for a fixed term. We can't fire him, no matter how nuts he is, and so that he feels independent from the government. So when the government feels financial pressure, he doesn't feel like he has to print money to finance the government's deficit. Okay? Imperfect, right? It's all muddling through, right? And remember, all of this is new. All of this is since 1970. Everything about central bankers and how they behave today are 50 years old, and that's it. Like, no history before that is relevant, other than these occasional hyperinflations. So we're muddling through. That's the current thoughts on central bankers. Seems to be true. Seems to be that countries where the government has more control and can easily fire the central bank presidents tend to get into more troubles like this. They tend to have higher inflation because they're trying to monetize the deficits. But your mileage may vary. We don't know everything yet. We're learning. Okay. Okay, so a couple of stories we can tell based on this. And just to give you a little practice playing around with the money. Okay? One thing we could ask is who should run the central bank? And this story is, suppose you're a left-wing commie union organizer bastard, and you've spent your whole life organizing unions and getting these guys together and fighting the man and the good fight, and you really care about the people, and you really, 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 really care about unemployment. Okay, suppose that's you. And you become Taoiseach. Glorious days. It's a weird election. The votes are weird and they split. And anyway, you end up with it. And you're, I don't know, I wasn't even in office. But anyway, you're Taoiseach now. And so they picked a name out of a hat. I don't know how you got it. But now you're Taoiseach. And you have this very, 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 very worker-oriented idea. Right? You really want unemployment low. Yeah, you don't want inflation, but like, is it really that important? No, the worker is important, right? So that's you. We're gonna pretend, okay? And now I get a chance to appoint someone to be head of the central bank. Okay? Totally up to me. I'm just gonna maximize my political ideals because obviously I'm a great politician, you are. And I get to decide what kind of guy to pick. So I got two candidates. One, the banking establishment. They suggest that I hire an investment banker who cares a lot about inflation, could care less about unemployment. Or you could appoint your friend Sally. And Sally's been with you in the trenches all this time. Sally cares about the right things. Sally has the same goals that you do. She wants unemployment low. Let's appoint Sally. She's got the right attitude. And this investment banker wanker, like, who wants him in charge of your central bank? He's totally conservative nuts. Well, who should you appoint? Well, it's the central bank. It isn't in charge of industrial policy, right? It's just in charge of the money supply. Little slips of monopoly money floating around. How many monopoly monies should be out there? Either way, both of these candidates are going to achieve the same rate of unemployment, right? They're both going to end up with the natural rate of unemployment. Right? But my left-wing guy is going to have a higher inflation bias. The conservative guy is going to have a lower inflation bias, right? Because for both of them, they have the desire to reduce unemployment. He's a bastard, but he's not like evil. He just has a twisted view of the world. What can you do? But he still wants unemployment lower, like all else equal. And so both of them are willing to give up a little bit of inflation to get lower unemployment. But Sally is going to want it so much more, right? And so in the end, people are going to set their inflation expectations high enough so that it just balances out, so that the cost of increasing inflation just balances out the cost of the benefit of reducing unemployment. Okay? And for the conservative guy, that's going to happen really fast because he cares a lot about inflation. Whereas for Sally, it's going to take quite a while because unemployment is so important to her. Right? And so we're going to end up with the same rate of unemployment, but we're going to end up with Sally, we're going to end up with much higher inflation. Okay? So we got no benefit out of having Sally, which is just saying it's the wrong position for Sally. Give her something important. Don't stick her in charge of the central bank. Like central bank is playing with money. Right? It's how much money do we have out, how much money do we have in. In the end, they are not going to change the natural rate of unemployment. Okay, they're just playing with monopoly money. If you want to change the natural rate of unemployment, it's job training, it's how our industrial policy is set up, it's how unions interact with industry, it's all of that kind of stuff is natural rate of unemployment stuff. Playing with monopoly money is not, which is what we're seeing here. It's not that Sally's a bad person, she's just a bad person for this job. Right? This is a job about inflation. In the end, it won't change the natural rate of unemployment. Now, there is one caveat to this, and that is Sally might react different in a crisis than he does. Right? The reason we want to have flexibility is so that if times get bad, the central bank can do something about it. And she might be better at doing something about it than he is. Okay? So that's off the table. But the equilibrium level of inflation will be higher for her than it is for her. Now, what I would suggest to you, I don't have a graph for this, but you should try to graph these two cases. What would happen? Draw the graph side by side. What would happen with Sally? What would happen with this investment banker douchebag? Right. So that you can see if you understand how the model's working. Okay. This idea, by the way, is attributed to Ken Rogoff. And I mention Ken Rogoff, first of all, because it's his idea. And when I know whose idea it is, I tend to mention it. But also, Ken Rogoff was very nice to me. So I think we should give him credit He helped, some guy plagiarized my paper and he helped sort it all out. So, yeah, good old Ken. Okay. Okay. And that, by the way, is another reason to have central banks be independent. Because if people want to elect somebody who really wants unemployment to be low, which is a reasonable thing for people to elect somebody to do, right? And the government does have some say on what unemployment rate ends up being. Well, when they elect that person, you don't necessarily want that same person in charge of the money supply, right? Because the things you can achieve with money supply are very different from the things that you can achieve with other tools of government. Okay? Even though we use the same, well, we talk about stabilization policy and we pretend like they're the same, but in fact, government has lots of other roles other than playing around with the money supply. So it's another reason to have independent central bankers. Okay. Another story we can tell, which is someplace that this model is often used for, is bringing inflation under control. So suppose we have very high inflation, like we had in the mid to late 70s, right? Or we're a developing country and we have really high inflation and we want to bring it down, right? Or it could happen to us, you know. There's nothing magic about us, but so far so good. Okay, not going. So we want to bring inflation under control. Okay. What's going to happen? Well, somehow our old central bank president wasn't doing it because he got us this high inflation in the first place. So we appoint someone new, right? And we appoint this new person who really wants to get inflation under control. We appoint Rogoff's conservative central banker. Good for us, right? Okay. Cares about unemployment, but not so much. Really cares about inflation, so wants to get inflation under control. What's going to happen? Okay, let me work through the graph rather than just show it to you. It'll make more sense if I work through it. So I've got our unemployment, I've got our inflation, we've got our natural rate of unemployment. And initially, we're somewhere up here, where this is expected inflation. Right, so we've got our Phillips curve. Let's see if I keep the colors similar. Okay. And before, obviously, we were just tangent there. We were at our long-run equilibrium. But now we appoint a new guy. And our new guy has different preferences. Our new central bank president really wants inflation low, okay? Which means his indifference curves are very flat, right? It's flat because to get more unemployment, to get less unemployment, he's only willing to give up a very, very little bit of inflation, right? If I was willing to give up a lot of inflation, I'd have steep indifference curves. But if I'm only willing to give up a little bit of inflation, I have very flat indifference curves. Right, so our guys, if I can get a different color, our guys' indifference curves, that's not good. Okay, let me do it again. I'm going to draw it super flat so it's clear. Okay, it's very flat because we have this new guy, right? So it's nothing in equilibrium. What's going to happen? Well, two things. First thing is, given that this is our Phillips curve, people set their wages, and now I appoint the new guy. Initially, he's going to do the best he can. He's going to get on the lowest indifference curve that he can, right? And so we're going to have an indifference curve tangent somewhere like this. And we're going to have, in year one, we're going to have unemployment 1 and inflation 1. So we get this situation where we get this new guy in, unemployment goes up, and inflation comes down a little bit. Okay? Now, what happens next? It depends on what people think is going on, right? One thing that could be going on is that people believe this guy. Like, I know him. Oh, Steve, complete jerk. He's definitely going to go for getting inflation under control. I trust in Steve. I don't like him, but I trust him. I think he's really going to get inflation under control. Everybody thinks that. We could go all the way down to a new long-run equilibrium. Let me put long run in there with an indifference curve looking like that. Okay. If people completely understand the model, they completely understand who they're dealing with, and everyone sets their wages at the same time, we could immediately jump down to the long-run equilibrium. Right? This is called rational expectations. Which is something we're going to spend the next month and a half talking about. Okay? Rational expectations, and the story here is that people in this model, in this world, they know how the world they live in works, and how the world they live in works is this model. Right? So people in the economy know this model. And so they know who this guy is, they know his indifference curves, and if they have any other expected inflation, they won't get the inflation they expected, because he'll choose something else. And so you can jump right down here. Okay? That's a possibility. Like it's a theoretical possibility. It is how we tend to do expectations in macroeconomics these days. But it's not necessarily realistic, right? It could be that you see, okay, the first year we got inflation a bit lower than we expected. Okay, I might have what's called adaptive expectations, where I just think tomorrow is going to be like today. Okay, that was fun. Okay, I lost my entire graph. Fun times. And if I have expectations, if I have adaptive expectations, I think tomorrow is going to be like today. And so I'm just going to take that new inflation rate as my new expected inflation, and we'll slowly ratchet down, and we'll slowly reduce on inflation, and the whole time we're going to have high unemployment. Okay? It really depends how and how fast people's expectations adjust. This unemployment could be really protracted. It could take years and years to get rid of this unemployment. Or it could go really fast, just depending on how people's expectations adjust. Okay? So, can we get things to work? We cannot. Everything's the worst. Okay. So these short-run Phillips curves could come down slowly, right, going to a point like B initially, then to a point like C, and so on and so on. Or we could just jump down to D all at once. Okay? And if we look at countries that have been successful in getting their high inflation under control, that had 100%-ish inflation and somehow managed to get them under control. Looking, for example, Argentina, Brazil, Israel, Turkey, that had high inflation and then got them under control. A couple of common things go through them. Typically they try multiple times to do it, right? And they tend to be countries that have unstable governments, that the governments don't stick around for too long, and that's because it's always tempting to print money, right? And if you're not going to be around very long, you print money, and your political opponent's going to be in charge when the inflation comes due, so why the hell not, right? But if you have very stable governments, they say, well, if I print money now, a year from now we're going to have inflation, that's going to be my problem, and so they endogenize that more. So, and countries that have a great need for money tend to be countries that are in volatile situations. They got wars, they got crises and all, and that leads to volatile governments as well. It works both ways, right? Economic instability leads to short-term governments. Short-term governments also leads to a willingness to have high inflation. So, a chicken or egg sort of situation. Okay. So these countries would typically try to control inflation. They'd have a new government come in, we're going to get inflation under control. But even if they appoint a very conservative central banker, as soon as unemployment goes up, they get kicked out of office, right? So they can't, people don't, even if they believe that central banker really is trying to control unemployment, they don't believe he's going to be around very long. And so there's no point setting your wages based on this guy staying in his work, because he's not going to stay in his work. So there's going to be somebody new along in 10 minutes. So you have a very hard time controlling inflation. When they have been able to control inflation successfully, it tends to be not very costly. These attempts can be extremely costly. Unemployment can be high for quite a while. But when it's successful, it tends to go down really fast. And this happens when you have two things that happen. You have a government that makes it, in the election campaign, their main goal to get inflation down. They're very public about it. This is how we want to be measured. This is how we want to be evaluated. Inflation is our thing. So they're really committed to it. So it feels like they're going to stick around even if unemployment is high. And they have a large majority, so that it really feels that they're a stable government. And when that happens, it turns out it's no big deal. Inflation just comes right down. But you need it to feel like they're willing to stick it out even if it's not a big deal. Okay? Otherwise, you get this thing where you get stuck at points like B and C for quite a while. Okay, so this model is really nice for telling these sort of stories. Very nice for telling stories about high inflation and central bankers and this kind of thing. I will say that our local macroeconomics guru, Carl Whelan, really, really, really intensely dislikes this model. Like, it's his thing. He's written articles about how horrible this model is. You can talk to him about it and find out why he thinks so. I have my theories. We've had some talks. And the main reason, and why a lot of people dislike the model, is because for 15 years it was horribly, horribly, horribly misused in the practical community. Okay? So it's very nice in terms of telling a story, of understanding what's going on, seeing how expectations and policy are intertwined. But so many people, like in central banks, like there's a whole 15-year period of people running these stupid regressions. This is going on YouTube, isn't it? Okay, well, anyway. Stupid regressions that they ran. And they would say, we have high inflation in our country. Is that because of expectations, or is that because people are printing money? Right? And this would be sort of how they would think about this model, which is so wrong, because it's always both. Right? It's expectations and printing money together. So you can't separate the two out in the model. But, it says that, the model says that expectations will affect the amount of money that's in the economy. And it also says that the central bank's choice will affect the amount of money that's in the economy. But it also says that they're jointly determined, right? So you can run a regression and you can pretend to know, but I mean, it's horrible misuse of the model, and this is the curse of the theorists, is to watch empirical people mangle their models. It's kind of like history, right? People who don't know history are doomed to repeat it. People who do know history are doomed to watch other people repeat it. You're screwed either way. So yeah, like for practical work, it's been horribly misused, so it's quite tempting to blame the model. The model, I think, is quite useful and elegant, but be careful when you do your empirical work. That's my call out there. How are we doing? Okay. If you haven't watched this, I know some of you watched this from my class, but if you haven't listened to this podcast before, please go listen to this podcast. It's about controlling high inflation. And now that you've seen this, this is going to be a pain my whole life. Now that you've seen this, you can think about that podcast in terms of this augmented Phillips curve model. Okay. That's what we have for Phillips curves. Don't running away or anything. I have 10 more minutes. I know when I'm switching things, people want to get up and go, but don't. I'm not going to. I have 10 more minutes. I can start the next thing. So next week, the tutorials start. So on Friday, I'll post a homework about this Phillips curve model. You will turn your homework in the tutorials, and they'll work through some problems and discussions about them. And most importantly, you can ask questions of the tutorial people. Okay, so expect on Friday to see a homework, and then if you have tutorial this Tuesday, then you'd want to have your homework done by Tuesday. Okay. Our next thing, which is a big thing and a big chunk, is the Fisher-Gray model. This is Stanley Fisher and Joanna Gray. They wrote this basically versions of this model completely separately. They're not like working together. They're two big shots working on big ideas. And so we can't disentangle them anymore, so Fisher-Gray. And this is going to take a while, and this is where the math bit's going to kick in. This is where it's going to be math, 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 math. My God, what is wrong with this man? We're doing more math. Right, this is where we start. Joy to the world. Now, the point of this is we have a situation where we know that expectations matter a lot. Like, they are really fundamentally central to everything in macroeconomics. Right? You can just if you think about what we did last year, right, we had y equals c plus I plus g plus net exports, right? Well, that's just what GDP, an accounting identity for GDP, right? This is the amount of stuff we produce. And we thought about consumption. We thought, well, consumption there's the part that depends on your income, and there's this autonomous part, right? And if you think you're going to be unemployed, you're not going to spend as much as if you thought you were going to have a job. If you think you're going to be promoted, you're going to spend more than if you don't think you're going to be promoted. So consumption, pretty directly, depends on expectations. And investment clearly depends on expectations, right? Investment is giving up something today in order to increase your productivity tomorrow. So you guys are investing right now. If you thought there was absolutely no jobs for university graduates and you'd be blacklisted and just starve on the street, only a brave few of you would be here, right? The people, I don't mind starving on the street. I just want to know about GDP. There'd be a few, right? There's always a few. But vast majority, you say, yeah, maybe it's not just an investment good, but it is, you don't want to be wasting 3-4 years of your life. You want to have something at the end of it would be nice. And so if you expect the job market to be good, you're more likely to go to university. If you expect it to be bad, you're less likely to go to university. And I know that there are a fair number of people who chose economics because the job prospects are relatively good compared to other things. I think that's bad advice, by the way. I think people should do what they like and what they're good at, and if they're good at something, they'll have opportunities. I think the reason sociologists make less than economists are because they're just not money-oriented. They're just not. And economists, they're money-grubbing little bastards. But anyway, that's neither here nor there, but a lot of people do choose economics because they think it's going to lead to better job prospects, which is historically true. Okay. So investment will also be expectations. And if you think about Hewlett-Packard, right, they're deciding, do I build a factory or don't I build a factory? It's going to take them 5 years to build the factory, 5 years to build 2 years to build an office building. They're spending a lot of money now, hoping to make a profit later. So clearly what they expect the future to look like is going to matter for that investment decision, right? And investment is the most volatile part of GDP. So it really is something that we think, yeah, changes in investment might be driving business cycles. And so if we want to understand any of that, we have to understand where expectations come from. Okay? And we have this little Phillips curve model that says, look, we can do a theory that says where expectations come from. We have people choosing their wages based on expectations. We got central bank choosing the best it can do based on people's wages. And we get inflation in there. Okay? But what we don't get out of that is any kind of understanding of the good side of monetary policy or fiscal policy, that you might be able to affect things in a downturn. Because there's no downturn, we're just in a steady state. In order to have some kind of business cycle, we need some kind of randomness in the model, some kind of thing that we're trying to predict that is not known yet. Right? And in all of these stories so far, everything we've had so far, everything's kind of known already. And so there's no reason for people to like make a bad call, right, on their investment. But really, sometimes they build office buildings and then no one shows up. And sometimes they don't build office buildings and everybody wants an office and it's like, I should have built one back in the day, right? This is an important part of investment. It's an important part of consumption. We don't know whether we're going to be unemployed in 2 years or not. We just have to make our best guess. And so we need a model that incorporates that. Right? So that's what we're doing here with this Fisher-Gray model. We're trying to really understand expectations in a world where things aren't perfectly predictable. Okay? So what should we expect in the future? And we're going to discuss what's possible for the central bank to do versus not do. It's also true of fiscal authorities, but we're going to focus on monetary policy here. So what is it possible for the central bank to do? What kind of policy tools are really available to them? What's going to work? What's not going to work? Given that, people are going to try to predict what they're up to. Okay. Okay. I'm going to leave it there. Let you go 3 minutes early so that I don't, yeah. But next time we're getting stuck into the math, right? So.